This is part 4 in what is now a 5-part series on learning. In this video, we're going to talk about the timing of reinforcements and punishments, the effectiveness of punishments, and the applications of operant conditioning. In the last video, we talked about schedules of reinforcement, continuous and intermittent. We talked about the specific types, fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval. And then we kind of wrapped up with a comparison of the 4. But the question is this: when's the best time to give reinforcement? When does the reinforcement need to be delivered in order to be effective? Well, the obvious answer is immediately after the behavior. If a behavior that you want to encourage occurs, and then you wait, a long amount of time before reinforcing it, there can be a lot of other behaviors that occur in between. And so when the reinforcement is finally delivered, it's more difficult to make the association with that reinforcement and the earlier behavior. It's much more likely that the reinforcer will be associated with the most recent behavior. So as close to the behavior as possible. But what if that isn't possible? What if it's just not capable? If you promise that you're going to give your class extra time at recess, but recess is after lunch and you want them to behave before lunch, how do you get them to hold over and delay that reinforcement and still let it be effective? Well, one of the things we can do is create token economies, where we give small pieces of reinforcers or secondary reinforcers that can then add up or be earned to then be kind of traded in for the primary reinforcer. A teacher may say, every time you guys are on task, you're going to get a star on the board, and if you accumulate a certain number of them, you'll get extra recess. Or you could use any kind of ticket or token to then delay the delivery of the primary reinforcer, which may be too big to be given or impractical to be given at the moment. What about punishment? When does punishment need to be delivered in order to be effective? Well, like we said with reinforcers, we need the punishment to occur as close to the behavior as possible in order to be effective. I'm all over the place here. So, the answer is the same. So if you come home and you found that your dog has chewed up the couch, the couch, then you might punish the dog. Well, the dog has just run up to you wagging his tail, and all of a sudden you're yelling, "Bad dog," and possibly swatting him on the nose. Well, to him, the behavior that's being punished is the most recent behavior. He'd have a tough time associating that punishment that may have happened hours after he did the behavior of chewing up the couch. So it wouldn't be a very effective punishment at that time. If you could catch the dog in the act of misbehaving and punishing him then, it would be much more likely that he would associate that punishment with the behavior we're trying to get rid of. Now, with that said, it brings us to a question about the effectiveness of punishment in general. Now, when we looked at reinforcers and schedules of reinforcement, we just said that intermittent schedules of reinforcement really work to strengthen behaviors, even better than a continuous schedule of reinforcement. Well, can the same be said about punishment? We know that punishment needs to be delivered close to the behavior in order to be effective, but what about how consistent we are with the delivery of punishment? It turns out that what's good for reinforcing behavior is actually very bad for punishing a behavior. If you enforce punishment inconsistently, intermittently, you might actually have the opposite effect of what you're trying to do. If you punish some behaviors sometimes, but not other times, it makes it very difficult to learn the association that that behavior is something that we shouldn't do. It actually undermines the learning process. There's only one schedule that we would use for punishment that's appropriate, and that's a continuous or fixed ratio, with the ratio being 1. The learner must know without a doubt that an undesired or inappropriate target behavior will be followed by removal of a pleasant stimulus or the addition of a negative adverse stimulus, aka punishment. Using an intermittent schedule, when one is attempting to reduce a behavior may actually lead to strengthening of the behavior and certainly an unwanted end result. Next question, and this relates. Does punishment eliminate behavior, or is it just suppress behavior? I would argue that punishment does not eliminate behaviors. We talk about it reducing the likelihood of behaviors, but I would say a better word is that it suppresses behaviors. They're not unlearned at that point, and they suppress the behavior more readily in the presence of the punisher. So if the punisher is not around, the behavior is not likely to be suppressed. So, what's next? What does the punishment need to be? Does the punishment need to relate to the behavior being punished? Let's say that the behavior we want to reduce is you leaving your dirty dishes on the counter. Instead, we'd rather you put them in the dishwasher. So, for the third time this week, you've left your dirty dishes on the counter, and so I say to you, you know what? I'm tired of this. Go clean the garage. Does that make any sense? What does cleaning the garage have to do with leaving dirty dishes on the counter? Maybe a better punishment would be, since you left dirty dishes on the counter, you have to do everyone's dishes for the rest of the week. In that way, the punishment relates to the behavior that we want to eliminate, and it's much more likely that the learning association will occur. So now, can we make a list of things we would want to do to make sure that our punishment is effective? Let's do that. In order for punishment to be most effective, it needs to be delivered consistently on a continuous schedule. It needs to immediately follow the unwanted behavior. The punishment should relate to the behavior if possible. The punisher needs to be present. And probably most important, and not yet discussed, is that it needs to be paired with reinforcement of an alternate desired behavior. Punishing a behavior you don't want doesn't inform the person or organism as to what behavior they should be doing. So trying to reinforce the desired behavior is also a very important part of changing the behavior. Now that we understand how we can use reinforcement to increase the likelihood of behavior and use punishment to decrease the likelihood of behavior, let's put it into action. Let's say we wanted to teach this rat to turn in a circle before we give it food. Well, all we have to do is wait for the rat to turn a circle, and then we'd give it food. But the problem is, we have to wait for the behavior to happen. In operant conditioning, we don't elicit behaviors like we do in classical conditioning. We wait for the behavior to happen, and then we reinforce it. So we might not see that behavior. But what if we saw a behavior that was part of the way there? So let's say that we've taught the rat that food comes out of here, and the rat is hungry, and whenever we'd like to see the rat do a circle before we fed him, but it's not doing circles. So the rat's in the cage, and he turns to the right, and we give him food. He runs over and gets his food, and he's in here doing rat things, and he happens to turn to the right again, and we give him food. If we wait and do this enough times, the rat will very quickly learn that if he turns to the right, he gets food. Well, the next day we put the rat in the Skinner box, and he immediately starts turning to the right because the day before that got him food. But today, when he turns to the right, we don't give him food. So he tries it again, he turns to the right, we don't give him food. He's like, man, I'm turning right, give me food. And he turns a little bit more to the right, and we give him food. And then we wait again until he gets right, no food, a little bit more, we give him food. And now we've gotten him closer to the target behavior. The next day, he has to turn a little further before he gets food. And the next day, a little further, and before long, the rat, we put him in the cage, and he immediately starts running in circles, running over and getting his food. Now, that behavior didn't exist before, but components of it did. And what we did is a process called shaping. We reinforced, let me move this down, successive approximations towards the target behavior. And we can shape behavior in all kinds of animals and people by finding pieces of the behavior we want, or approximations of it, and then slowly shaping that behavior over time to get the complete behavior that we'd like to see. You could use this shaping behavior to teach your dog to roll over, or something similar. Well, let's think about a more complex behavior. Let's look at something like this bear in the circus riding a bike. Now, how do you do this? How do you train that? Well, there's a problem here. And the problem is that bears riding a bike is not a behavior that's going to happen that you can reinforce. It's just not going to happen. It's not in that bear's biological set of predisposition of behaviors. But if you look at it carefully, the components of what the bear is doing, each piece of it is within his set of behaviors. So you're not going to wait around for the bear to get on the bike and then reinforce it. But we can do what's called a process called chaining. The chaining is the linking of two or more simple behaviors that must be completed before reinforcement. So first you train one behavior, reinforcing it, shaping it. Then you add another behavior, you reinforce and shape it. And then you require that those behaviors happen in sequence before they get reinforced. And through this, you can generate what look like very complicated behaviors, and behaviors that look like they'd be out of the subset of behaviors that an animal or even a person would do. But through the simple processes of both shaping and then chaining, we could reinforce these behaviors such that they happen in sequence. So we might make our rat run in a circle, press the lever, jump up and down twice before getting food. Each one of those behaviors could be shaped and reinforced and then linked together in a chain of events. Or maybe before you can get dessert, you have to clean off your spot at the dinner table, wipe down the table, and fold your clothes, or whatever it might be, that before you got reinforced. The point is, as it was in classical conditioning, we are limited by biological predispositions as to what behaviors we can shape and we can chain. They have to exist first. When we look at the principles of operant conditioning, it makes it look as if anyone's behavior can be controlled, shaped, modified, and to some extent it can. But, just like in classical conditioning, we have to remember the power of the human mind for cognition and thought, and understand that even though these principles are powerful, they don't override people's ability to think. And there is a word of caution here. Reinforcers can be misused. If rewards are given out indiscriminately or without reason, they can start to lose their effectiveness and even have some undesired effects. If we use reinforcers to encourage activities that are already inherently intrinsically motivating, we may be applying an extrinsic motivation on something that was intrinsically reinforcing and eventually erode the intrinsic value of those activities. That's a concept we'll talk more about in class. I want to finish with the last thing, a comparison of classical and operant conditioning. It's kind of important that we make this distinction. Both of these are forms of associative learning. In classical conditioning, a response, a behavior, is involuntary, it's automatic, it is elicited, it's drawn out. Whereas in operant conditioning, the behavior is voluntary as the individual operates on their environment. In classical conditioning, the acquisition is a linking or an association between two stimuli. A neutral stimulus, or which will become the conditioned stimulus, announces or predicts the arrival of the unconditioned stimulus, and that's the link. In operant conditioning, we associate a response or behavior with a consequence, a reinforcer or a punisher. Extinction appears in both, and extinction occurs in classical conditioning when we present the conditioned stimulus alone without the unconditioned stimulus, and eventually the conditioned response will decrease. And extinction in operant conditioning occurs when the behavior occurs with no reinforcer following. Eventually that behavior might decrease in occurrence. And of course, this idea of biological predisposition, that in classical conditioning, natural predispositions contain which stimuli and which responses can be easily associated. In other words, which one makes sense that they should be linked. And in operant conditioning, organisms best learn behaviors similar to their natural behaviors, and unnatural behaviors instinctively drift back towards natural ones. That completes our four-part series on associative learning. In the next video, and hopefully the last video for this unit, we'll talk about latent learning and social learning or observational learning.